In 1947, a businessman flying his private plane near Mount Rainier reported 9 objects skipping across the sky like saucers thrown across water, and the term stuck before anyone had checked whether it meant anything. In 1948, the United States Air Force opened an official project to investigate these reports because pilots, trained pilots, the kind of men who do not panic at clouds, kept filing them. By 1952, that same Air Force had logged thousands of sightings from police officers, military radar operators, airline crews. And after all of that, after the planes, after the radar returns, after the official project with its official budget and its official scientists sitting in an office in Dayton, Ohio, we still had not found a single object we could put in a lab and test. Not one. That scientist was me. And for the first 15 years of my involvement in this question, I was the man whose job it was to make sure you never lost a night's sleep over it. Now look, I want to tell you something about myself that most people who know my name don't know, because I spent a long time making sure they wouldn't find out. I have a doctorate in astrophysics from the University of Chicago, earned at Yerkes Observatory under Otto Struve, a man who did not tolerate sloppy thinking in his students for even one afternoon. I spent the Second World War at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, helping build the radio proximity, fuse the device that made anti-aircraft shells detonate when they got close to a target instead of needing a direct hit, which is to say I spent the war doing the most hard-nosed, unsentimental, kill-or-be-killed applied physics there is. I went on to chair the astronomy department at Northwestern University. I tracked the first satellites for the International Geophysical Year. I am, by training and temperament, the last man on Earth you would expect to be remembered for unidentified flying objects. And yet here I am, and here is the question I have spent 4 decades chewing on, not are they real, because that question is too crude to even ask properly yet. The question is this: what happens to a scientist's mind against his own will when the evidence keeps refusing to lie down and die the way he was told it would? Here is the wrong idea. I am going to fight for the next while, and I want you to see it clearly before I start swinging at it, because it is sneakier than it looks. It is not the belief that UFOs are spaceships. I was never much persuaded of that, and I am still not. The idea I am fighting is older and, I think, far more corrosive to science than any flying saucer ever was. It is the belief that an unexplained observation and a worthless observation are the same thing, that if you cannot identify what a witness saw, the only intelligent thing to do is stop thinking about it, file it, and move on, because absence of explanation is itself a kind of proof that nothing was there worth explaining. I am going to call this the closed file fallacy, and I want you to notice over the next 4,000 words how many places it hides. It hid inside the United States Air Force for 2 decades. It is hiding right now inside plenty of perfectly respectable scientific minds who would never fall for a flying saucer story, but who fall for this fallacy every day of the week about all sorts of things that have nothing to do with the sky. In 1948, I was a happy man with a telescope and a stable career, and the Air Force came to me and asked whether I would consult on something called Project Sign. They needed an astronomer who could look at a UFO report and tell them quickly and cheaply whether the witness had simply misidentified Venus or a weather balloon or a flock of geese lit up by a sunset. I said yes immediately, and I want to be honest with you about why. I thought it would take perhaps a year. I thought the whole subject was, and these are close to my actual words at the time, utterly ridiculous, a fad that would pass the way fads do. I was good at the job because I believed in the job. Roughly 9 reports out of every 10 that crossed my desk I could explain within an afternoon using nothing but a star chart and common sense. Swamp gas, ball lightning, the planet Jupiter mistaken for a hovering light, a man's own headlights reflected off a cloud bank. I debunked them cheerfully, And I want you to sit with that word cheerfully for a second, because in my 1977 book, I admitted flat out that I enjoyed the debunking. It felt like exactly what a scientist should be doing, taking irrational fear and replacing it with rational explanation, one case at a time. That was not yet my turn. That was just a man doing his job well. The turn, when it came, did not come from a flying saucer landing in my backyard. It came from somewhere far more boring and far more dangerous to my comfort. It came from the file drawer of cases I could not explain, and from how my own employer wanted me to treat that drawer. Let me ask you something, and sit with it before I answer. If a scientist examines 10,000 reports and explains 9,000 of them convincingly, what should he conclude about the 1,000 he cannot explain? Most people's gut answer is, those are probably just the hard cases, give it time, they'll fall too. That was the Air Force's official answer, and for years it was mine. But here is where it starts to come apart, and it comes apart on a mechanism, not a feeling. The unexplained cases were not randomly distributed in quality. When I sorted my files, and I want to be precise here, because this is the actual mechanism, not a vague gesture toward good evidence. The unexplained residue was disproportionately made of reports from trained observers, airline pilots who know precisely what a weather balloon looks like at altitude because they fly past them for a living, police officers trained to give measured testimony in a courtroom, military radar operators whose entire profession is distinguishing real returns from clutter. The cases that explained away easily came overwhelmingly from untrained civilians glancing up for 3 seconds at dusk. The cases that refused to explain came overwhelmingly from people whose job every single day was not to be fooled by things in the sky. That asymmetry is the brick the rebuild starts on. It does not prove spaceships. It proves something narrower and to a scientist more uncomfortable, that the unexplained residue was not simply the dregs of bad witnessing. It was disproportionately the best witnessing I had. In April of 1953, I put this discomfort into print in the Journal of the Optical Society of America, in a paper called Unusual Aerial Phenomena. I wrote a line there that people quote at me to this day, usually without knowing where it came from. That ridicule is not part of the scientific method, and people should not be taught that it is. I was not yet saying the phenomenon was extraterrestrial or even necessarily mysterious. I was saying something much narrower, and I thought much harder to argue with, that a scientist's obligation when he cannot explain something is to say so honestly, not to manufacture a confident-sounding dismissal, because confident dismissal is more comfortable for everyone involved, including the scientist. That same year, I sat on something called the Robertson Panel. A group of physicists, the CIA, convened to evaluate the UFO question once and for all. The panel's conclusion was not, we studied this and found nothing. The panel's conclusion, and I was in the room, so I am not reporting hearsay, was that a public relations campaign should be mounted to train the public out of taking the subject seriously, specifically through ridicule, specifically through enlisting psychologists and even cartoonists to make the witnesses look foolish. I went along with it. I am not going to stand up here decades later and pretend I objected loudly in 1953, because I did not. But I want you to notice what just happened in this story, because it is the turn of the whole speech in miniature. A body of professional scientists decided, as policy, that the correct response to an unexplained observation was not investigate further, but make people too embarrassed to report it. That is the closed file fallacy wearing a government badge. Here is where the rebuild gets its second brick, and it is the one that actually moved me more than any single sighting did. It was not a UFO. It was an attitude, and I watched it for years before I let myself name what it was doing to me. The Air Force, with the Robertson panel's blessing, adopted a posture that everything had to have a conventional explanation, full stop, no exceptions, regardless of the specifics of any individual case. I want you to feel the weight of that policy the way I eventually did. It means that if a formation of UFOs had flown low and slow down a city's main street in broad daylight in front of 10,000 witnesses, with newspaper photographers present, the official posture required us to find a conventional explanation anyway, because the conclusion was fixed before the investigation began. I said in an interview decades later that I began to resent this, even though at the time I largely agreed with the Air Force's broader skepticism. That word resent is doing real work. You can share someone's general conclusion and still recognize that the way they are reaching it has stopped being science and become theater. That is precisely the gap I fell into. I was not becoming a believer in spacecraft. I was becoming someone who could no longer pretend that explain everything no matter what and investigate honestly were the same activity. I promised you I would close every loop I open, so let me close this one properly before I open the next. The closed file fallacy, applied as official policy, did something specific and measurable to the data. It guaranteed that no case, however strong, could ever survive in the unexplained column for long, because survival there was treated as institutional failure rather than honest reporting. Cases got reclassified under pressure. Explanations that strained credulity, a flock of birds explaining a radar and visual simultaneous sighting that also stalled a car's engine, got written down anyway because writing unexplained in the official log was, for practical purposes, forbidden. I watched this happen to specific cases with specific names, and I am going to tell you about one of them, because it is the case that did the most damage to my career and the most good for my honesty. Now here's where it gets strange, and I want you to actually picture this with me. Late March of 1966, a town called Dexter, Michigan, just outside Ann Arbor. Over 2 nights, close to 100 people, sheriff's deputies among them, reported strange lights and a low object hovering over a swamp. National media descended within hours, because by 1966 a UFO story was guaranteed ratings. The Air Force needed an explanation fast, and they asked me to provide one. I went to the site, I interviewed witnesses, and I found that a portion, not all, a portion of what was reported was consistent with marsh gas, methane released from decaying vegetation, occasionally igniting into a pale glow under exactly the right conditions of temperature and moisture. I said so carefully at a press conference, and I repeated more than once that this explained only some of the sightings, not the whole event. It did not matter. The phrase that survived the press conference was simply swamp gas, stripped of every qualifier I had attached to it, and it became a national punchline within 48 hours. Congressmen mocked it on the floor of the House. I became, almost overnight, the scientist who told frightened, credible witnesses that they had seen marsh gas glowing in a swamp. Full stop. End of discussion. I want to tell you what that felt like, because it is the single most humiliating professional moment of my life. And it is also the moment that finished what 1953 had started. I had given an honest, partial, heavily qualified explanation, and the qualifiers had been erased not by me, but by an apparatus, government and press together, that needed a simple, closed file far more than it needed an honest, open one. I learned, standing at that podium, exactly how strong the pressure toward false closure really is, because I felt it crush my own careful words within a single news cycle. I did not dissent quietly after that. By the mid-1960s, I had begun saying so in public, And two cases in particular put me openly at odds with the Air Force's official line. And I want to walk through them because they show the mechanism, not just the feeling, behind my growing resentment. The first involved a police officer named Lonnie Zamora in Socorro, New Mexico, who reported a close encounter with a metallic egg-shaped craft on the ground, accompanied by two small figures, leaving physical indentations in the soil that investigators measured and photographed afterward. Zamora was, by every account from the men who knew him, a careful, sober, unimaginative witness, exactly the kind of person whose testimony a courtroom is built to trust. The Air Force's official file on the case still listed it. When pressed as unidentified, they could not produce a conventional explanation that fit the physical trace evidence, and to their credit, they did not pretend otherwise in the internal record, even while the public posture stayed dismissive. The second was the so-called Portage County chase in Ohio, where several police officers from different jurisdictions pursued a luminous object along a highway for roughly half an hour, handing off the pursuit between patrol cars as it crossed county lines, each officer independently radioing in a description that matched the one before it. Here is the assumption I want to demolish directly, because it is the same one that powered the swamp gas mockery. The assumption that the witnesses are policemen. So if this were real, it would have ended in an arrest, a press conference, conclusive evidence, as if reality has some obligation to resolve itself neatly because the people watching it happen to carry badges. Reality carries no such obligation. What both cases actually demonstrated, mechanism and all, was that the credibility of a witness has nothing whatsoever to do with whether the universe obliges him with a tidy resolution. A trained, sober observer can watch something for 30 straight minutes in relay across multiple corroborating witnesses and still hand you nothing you can put under a microscope. That is not evidence of fraud. That is evidence that some genuine residue of this phenomenon resists the very kind of resolution our instincts demand before we are willing to call something real. Let me give you the number that should make your stomach turn the way mine did. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's UFO investigation program, ran from 1952 to 1969, 17 years, and across that span it logged over 12,000 reports. After 17 years and 12,000 cases, the program's final official verdict was that essentially none of it represented a threat to national security, and essentially none of it represented anything beyond conventional explanation or insufficient data. Now, do the arithmetic with me the way I eventually forced myself to. If even 1% of 12,000 cases were genuinely inexplicable by any known phenomenon, and the documented residue ran well above that, you are talking about more than 100 cases involving trained military and law enforcement observers that no one in an official capacity was permitted to simply say out loud, "We do not know what this was." 100 honest mysteries swallowed by an institution that had decided in advance that the file marked unexplained was itself the failure to be avoided, not the honest output to be reported. I want to stop here and give you the part of this story where I do not come out looking good, because the character I am does not deal in false modesty in either direction. In January of 1967, two teenage brothers in Michigan produced a set of Polaroid photographs of what looked like a metallic hamburger-shaped object. I examined the photographs. I was denied access to the original prints by the family, and based on what I was shown, I gave a hedged but real endorsement, "No hoax visible," was close to my assessment. And that endorsement became a national headline within a day, stripped again of every hedge I had placed on it. There was, it turned out, very strong evidence available almost immediately. A local reporter had noticed that the serial numbers printed on the backs of the Polaroid prints did not match the sequence the boys claimed, evidence that had been published by the Associated Press nearly a week before I made my statement. I had missed it. It took 9 years before the brothers finally wrote a letter admitting the whole thing had been a hoax. I want you to notice that I am not telling you this story to make myself look like a tragic truth-teller persecuted by an unfair world. I am telling you this story because I was capable of being wrong in exactly the same way the witnesses I studied were capable of being wrong, and a scientist who has forgotten that about himself has stopped being useful to anyone. I want you to try a thought experiment with me here, because it's the only way I know to make the scale of this problem sit in your body instead of just your head. Imagine you are not me. Imagine you are an alien researcher, a visiting xenologist, if you like, assigned to survey planet Earth in the year 1968. And your only instructions are to evaluate how this particular species handles the boundary between what it knows and what it does not. You would find a civilization capable of landing instruments on the moon within the year, capable of splitting the atom, capable of mapping the genetic code. And you would also find that same civilization's chief investigative body for an unresolved aerial phenomenon operating under an explicit directive that every case must be explained, regardless of the specifics, before the file is allowed to close. You would conclude correctly that this species was extraordinarily good at hard science and extraordinarily bad at tolerating an honest blank space on a piece of paper. That tension, brilliant at the technical work, terrified of the unresolved file, is not a flaw unique to the Air Force or to ufology. It is, I have come to believe, close to a permanent feature of how trained minds behave when an institution is watching them work. So where does the rebuild land? After the swamp gas, after the hoax, after the Robertson panel and its ridicule campaign? Not at UFOs or alien spacecraft. I want to be extremely precise about this because sloppiness here is exactly the kind of thing I spent my life fighting against in everyone else. By the early 1970s, I had developed a 6-part classification system for these reports: nocturnal lights, daylight disks, radar visual cases, and then 3 tiers of what I called close encounters, ranked by proximity, with close encounters of the third kind reserved for the rare reports involving an apparent animate presence. I want you to notice what that classification system actually is. It is not a belief system. It is a taxonomy, the same kind of tool a biologist uses to sort species before he has any theory of evolution to explain them. I built it because I had become convinced of exactly one thing with confidence, that the phenomenon, whatever its ultimate nature, was not homogeneous, and that lumping a 5-second light in the sky together with a multi-witness, radar-confirmed, physical trace-leaving event and calling them both UFO reports was itself bad science, the same kind of category error as lumping a thunderstorm together with a meteor shower, because both happen in the same general direction up. Here is the moment of genuine, unresolved uncertainty I promised you, and I want to be honest that this is the part that unsettles me personally, not the part I find comforting. By 1973, in a speech I gave at a UFO research symposium titled "The Embarrassment of the Riches," I voiced a doubt that surprised the very people who thought I had become a believer. I said that a handful of strong sightings a year, worldwide, might support the idea of occasional visitors from elsewhere in the galaxy. But I had by then tens of thousands of reports on file, far more than the official statistics ever reflected. And I asked out loud to an audience that wanted me to say something simpler, why would any advanced civilization traveling across such distances produce thousands of sightings a year? scattered with what looked like no coherent purpose, startling livestock, stalling cars, behaving in ways that seemed less like reconnaissance and more like static. That number does not fit the tidy visitors from another world story half as well as people want it to, and it has never sat comfortably with me. I do not have a competing theory I am confident in. I want to say that plainly. On stage, rather than dress up my uncertainty as some kind of wisdom, I do not know what I am looking at. I have spent more hours on this question than almost any other human being alive, and the honest center of my position, even now, is a held, examined, uncomfortable, not knowing, not a triumphant alternate answer. I'll tell you about the moment that crystallized for me just how strange the residue actually was, because it is my favorite piece of evidence, and almost nobody uses it correctly. It is not a single dramatic sighting. It is a pattern across cases involving what I term the EM effect, electromagnetic interference, where vehicles report engines stalling, headlights dimming, radios cutting to static, in close proximity to a reported object with no aircraft, weather event, or known ground equipment in the vicinity capable of producing that effect at that range. I do not know what produces a coordinated electromagnetic disturbance of that kind in an open field at 2 in the morning. I genuinely do not. What I know is that the witness was tired and saw a planet, does not even attempt to explain a stalled ignition system, and it was definitely a flying saucer's force field, is exactly the kind of unearned leap I have spent my career refusing to make in either direction. The honest answer sits in between those two stories, in a space our vocabulary is not built for, and that gap, not little green men, is what kept me working on this until I was nearly 70 years old. Let me close this loop properly, because I owe you the full shape of what these decades cost and bought. By the time Project Blue Book was formally shut down in 1969, I had spent 21 years inside an institution that needed every file closed, and I had become, in the words of one of my own colleagues writing in his private journal at the time, a man treated with something close to contempt by his own astronomical community, invited to a Sputnik anniversary celebration, his own field's milestone, and quietly told beforehand not to mention the subject he had become known for. I want you to feel the actual cost of refusing the closed file fallacy, because it was not abstract. It was an invitation extended through gritted teeth and a warning attached to it. That is what it costs in a single human career to keep a file open that an entire institution needs shut. Now, before I bring this all the way home, I want to turn this outward, because the closed file fallacy is not really a UFO problem, and if you walk away from this thinking it is, I have failed you. Consider for a moment what a closed file actually represents in any field of science. A closed file is a claim that the boundary of current explanation is the boundary of reality itself, that what we cannot presently account for must, by that fact alone, not be worth accounting for. That is precisely the assumption that delayed recognition of continental drift for decades, because geologists could not yet explain a mechanism, so they treated the unexplained pattern of matching coastlines as a curiosity rather than a clue. It is precisely the assumption embedded right now in how we search for technological signals from other civilizations, because we have decided in advance what an artificial signal should look like based on our own radio technology, which means anything sufficiently different from our expectation gets filed as noise rather than investigated as anomaly. The closed file fallacy does not announce itself as ridicule. It announces itself as confidence, as efficiency, as let's not waste resources on outliers. And it is every single time The same mistake the Robertson panel made in 1953, dressed in whatever decade's professional language happens to be fashionable. So here is where the floor drops out, and I want you to feel it the way I have felt it for 40 years. If even a small residue of these cases, the trained observers, the radar visual confirmations, the engine stalling encounters with no conventional source, represents something genuinely outside our current physics, then we are not looking at a UFO problem. We are looking at evidence that our map of what is physically possible has at least one torn corner we have been folding under and ignoring because the torn corner is inconvenient and does not fit the page. Every great expansion of physics in history began exactly there, not at the comfortable center of the map, but at the torn edge nobody wanted to look at directly because looking meant admitting the map was incomplete. Try one more thought experiment with me before I let you go, because I think it is the clearest way I know to show you what is actually at stake underneath all of this. Picture our entire civilization's accumulated scientific knowledge as a single lit room in an otherwise dark house. We have spent 4 centuries making that room brilliantly, exhaustively well lit, every corner of it mapped, measured, and cross-checked 1,000 times over. The closed file fallacy is the belief that because the room is so thoroughly lit, the house must end at its walls, that anything reported from beyond those walls is by definition either a trick of the light bouncing back at us or a lie told by someone standing in the dark. But every doorway out of that room that we have ever actually walked through, into the room we now call quantum mechanics, into the room we now call relativity, into the room where continents drift on a molten sea we could not see or feel looked, from inside the old lit room, exactly like darkness with nothing in it. It looked that way right up until someone walked through anyway. I am not telling you there is a doorway behind these unexplained reports. I am telling you that the feeling of there is nothing further to investigate here is historically indistinguishable from the feeling right before a doorway is found, and I no longer trust that feeling to tell me which one I am having. I am not telling you the answer is extraterrestrial. I am telling you I have spent 4 decades watching brilliant people choose a false, comfortable certainty over an honest, uncomfortable, blank space on the map, and I no longer think that choice has anything to do with evidence. I think it has to do with how badly the human mind wants every file closed before bedtime. So I will leave you exactly where the Air Force never wanted me to leave anyone with the file open. Not open because I believe something thrilling is hiding inside it. Open because closing it without an answer was never honesty. It was relief dressed up as conclusion, and I gave too many years of my career to that particular disguise before I recognized it on my own face. The real question I am leaving in your chest tonight is not whether something is out there. It is this: how many other files, in how many other corners of what you think you already understand, have you let yourself close, not because the evidence ran out, but because staying open made you uncomfortable? And comfort is so very easy to mistake for proof.